Good morning. I want to welcome you to, actually, it's morning when I'm recording this, but this is being recorded for the Wednesday night Bible class at Lilac Road Church of Christ in Litchfield, Kentucky. And we are studying out of the book of Ezra. We've been doing a timeline of the children of Israel, basically tracing the history of the Old Testament. And we got to the book of Ezra, which deals with the Jews coming back from captivity. You may recall in earlier lessons, if you've been studying with us through 1st, 2nd Kings, the Jews had been carried off captivity. Northern Israel, the northern 10 tribes, were carried off by Syria and dispersed among various countries. And finally, Judah, the southern part of Israel, basically, was taken captive by Babylon and carried off to captivity. And as Jeremiah, the 29th chapter, points out, that after 70 years they would return back to the land. And so in Ezra, the first lesson we dealt with here, for chapters 1 and 2, really dealt with the Jews coming back. About 50,000 of them came back to the land of Canaan. And this letter here deals with really rebuilding the temple and the Jews coming back to the land and basically getting right with God again, simply worshiping God again as prescribed in the Old Testament under the law of Moses. And as you look at Ezra, there's 4 kings. And I don't want to be confusing. I don't have the ability to give you charts like I do the Bible class on Wednesday nights. But you find that there's only 4 prominent kings, and especially in this 4th chapter of Ezra. And the first one is Cyrus. Cyrus is the one we read about in chapter 1 that issued a decree that allowed Jews to return back to the homeland, return back to build the temple, basically. And basically, they reigned about 9 more years after that, giving that decree. And that decree was about 536, 537 BC. And then you had Ahasuerus, the next one, and he's also had another name, Cambyses. I hope I'm saying that right, but Cambyses. And he did not hinder the work either. He allowed it to go on. And then you had, and he reigned about 8 years. And then you have another king, Artaxerxes. And he stopped the work on the temple. We're going to see here in this 4th chapter. And basically, he stopped the work on the temple for a while. And then he reigned about only 7 months, not a very long reign. And then you have Darius. And Darius is the last king, really, that has anything to do with the book of Ezra. And he allowed the work to continue on. He encouraged the work to continue on. And so as we pick up in this lesson here, we're going to start at chapter 3. Again, chapters 1 and 2 gives us a record of the Jews returning back to the homeland. The people, about 50,000, include the priests, those who be workers at the temple. And the people went out to their land that they had used to live in, the cities they used to be in. And keep in mind now, when they did this, that this land was not vacant. It wasn't like, okay, here's the land of Canaan, nobody lives there. There were inhabitants there. There were people that had to live there. And so that's going to create friction between those folks and these Jews coming back. And so we start at chapter 3, you'll find that in the 7th month, children of Israel were in the cities. The people gathered against one man in Jerusalem. And so this would be the 7th month, and that would correspond to our September, October. I was trying to figure this out the other day, and I had it a little bit later, like October, November, but actually it's September, October, because their months do not line up with our months. About 3 months after their arrival, they arrived back on the 4th month, so 3 months later, and there's going to be a number of important events during this time period, September, October. This is the time of the Feast of Booths, as outlined in Leviticus 23rd chapter, and also Day of Atonement, as again outlined or given to us in the Day of Atonement. And the 2 leaders during that time period, 2 main leaders in the 2nd verse here of Ezra 3rd chapter, was Jeshua, and other passages may refer to him as Joshua, and also Zerubbabel. And this temple that's going to be built is going to be referred to as Zerubbabel's temple. He was apparently one of the main ones involved as far as the leadership of the children of Israel during this time period. And as you go on in verse 3, it points out to us what I just said here, that they came together. And actually in verse 4 said that they kept the Feast of Tabernacles as written by, and offered daily burnt offerings, and the number required by ordinance for each day. And then they skip down verse 5 and said, and not only did they have the regular burnt offering, but also those for new moons and for all the appointed feasts of the Lord that were consecrated. And so during this time period of being getting captives, they weren't allowed to do all this. They didn't have all this going on. And so now's the time of getting back to observing the feast of God. And if you look at verse 3, though, it points out to us. And verse 3, very first part of that verse says, though fear had come upon them because of the people of these countries. Now, again, like I said earlier, the people, the surrounding people was not going to be thrilled to death to having these Jews coming back and disrupting their lives. And so they're going to be their enemies, basically. And so the fear came upon them. Now, depending on translation, and this could be taken two ways. One is because they feared God, therefore, the last part of verse 3, they set their altar on its basis to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, both in the morning and evening offerings. In other words, because of their fear, they turned to God to offer these sacrifices. Now, the other way of reading this here is, despite the fact that they were fearful, they went ahead and served God anyway. And so what we did know is that there was fear, and they went ahead and served God. And at that point also, we have a collection being taken up now. If you go down verse 7, said they also gave money to the masons and the carpenters and food and drink and oil to people of Sidon and Tyre to bring cedar logs from Lebanon to the sea. In a lot of ways, this kind of corresponds to the days of Solomon as he builds the temple then, and that is he has to get things like cedar from, Tyre. And he has to get masons, the people, craftsmen to get to work here. So this money's being collected so they could go out and they could hire people and they could buy the resources or buy the material necessary to build the temple. So that's what they started doing. In verse 8, it goes on and said the second month of the second year. Now, again, that would be like our April, May, basically, that they came to the coming to the house of the Lord. And it points out the rest of the people, the priests and the Levites, and all those that had come out of the captivity to Jerusalem, began to work and appointed the Levites from 20 years old and above to oversee the work of the house of the Lord. And so this is going to be the beginning of the temple being made. Okay, now again, this is about 536, 535 BC. And so they start doing the work on the temple, and we find that when they lay the foundations, verse 10, they lay the foundation of the temple. The priests, they're there, and the Levites, the son of Asaph, assembles to praise the Lord according to the ordinance of David, king of Israel. And imagine now, you had heard growing up all about this temple. You had read about it from the law. The history of Solomon had not been lost. The Jews had that. And now they are at this place of actually laying the foundation and beginning the work of actually building the temple. And verse 11 says, and they sang responsively, praising you and thanks to the Lord. And, that's kind of a unique word, I guess, responsively. And that I take that to be with a whole heart. They sang with everything they had, and goes on and talks about that he is good, and for his mercy endures forever towards Israel, which is used a lot in Psalms, by the way, that phrase there. But then it says, then all the people shout of great joy, or a great shout when they praise the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. And today we may say, hallelujah, amen. That the fact is that finally this temple was being laid, and they were excited, and they were so appreciative of that happening. But then you had also talks about the older men. And as you look here in verse 12, so the old men who have seen the first temple. And so you have some folks that the temple was destroyed about 586 BC. And there were people taken captive at 606 BC, and then 598 BC, and then 586 BC. Okay, the temple was destroyed about 586 BC. And there were some people that were old enough that when they could remember the temple, but they were young enough, they actually lived all the way through the 70 years of captivity. So we're talking about people probably in their 80s and 90s at this point here. And can you imagine the feeling here of seeing the foundation of the temple being laid? And so they wept a loud voice when the foundation of the temple was laid before their eyes. And I thought about this in two senses. It could be, one is that the fact is that this was not the temple of Solomon. When they thought about the temple, and they would remember the temple of Solomon, all its grandeur and splendor, and this was not going to be the temple of Solomon. that could have been very discouraging. It could have been, very sad to them. But another way to look at it also is that finally they had anticipated seeing the temple being rebuilt, and now finally it was here. And so it could have been also tears of joy of the fact the temple was being laid again, and they're weeping. And that gets us to the end of chapter 3. Now, chapter 4 picks up, and we have the temple being laid out there, starting to build the temple, and the Jews are united in building the temple, and it seems like a good thing. But chapter 4 starts off with says, "Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the descendants of the captivity were building the temple of the Lord God of Israel." And these were the adversaries. These were the people, again, who have been transplanted into the land of Canaan. And some of these folks may have lived there for 60 and 70 years, that they had maybe a generation or two growing up there, that was their homeland now. And all of a sudden you have these Jews coming in, and they're rebuilding their temple. And these people did not like it. The people that lived there did not like it. In verse 2 of chapter 4, it points out that, and actually we don't get this in just a second, but they're pleading with the children of Israel to allow them to work on the temple too. But they say there that we have been offered a sacrifice to him, in other words, God, since the days of Ezra, king of Assyria, who brought us here. And so what they're pointing out is we've been offering sacrifice for many years here also. And so we want to help you build the temple. And to that, the Jews said no. And verse 3, chapter 4, verse 3, that Zerubbabel and Jeshua, the two leaders of Israel, and the rest of the heads of the father's house of Israel said to them. In other words, all the leadership said, you may do nothing with us to build a house for our God, but we alone will build to the Lord God of Israel as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. In other words, no, you can't have any part of this. We're going to be the ones to do this. And that may seem to be kind of harsh at first glance here to some people, but the Bible points out to us in the New Testament that you need to be careful of who you allow to be a part of your fellowship, who you're going to work with. And there needs to be the common bond. And for instance, over 2 Corinthians, just to kind of take a side trip for just a minute or two here, in 2 Corinthians 6th chapter, and this deals with those Christians that were tempted to go into the temple of idols and to eat their meats and feast with these people and still serve God, Jehovah. Well, verse 14 of 2 Corinthians 6th chapter says, "Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers." And he goes in and talks about what communion has light with darkness, what accord has Christ Belial, and what part of has a believer with an unbeliever, and what agreement has the temple of God with idols. And the answer is none. There's not a common ground between those. And so he ends, verse 17 says, "Come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you." In other words, he's saying that there's no commonality, there's no bond between you and idolatry, you and these other worshipers. And so that's the same thing here. There was really no commonality between the children of Israel who came back from captivity and people that lived in the land. And then if you look, because these people that lived in the land during 70 years were not worshipers of God, they were simply idolatrous people. And then 2 John and verse 9, it says, verse 9 and 10, verse 10 especially, "If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your house, nor greet him, for he who greets him shares in his evil deeds." And the point is, there's a difference between unity and union. We hear a lot today about the idea of Christian union, and that is we can agree to disagree. Unity says we're going to speak the same thing. We're going to believe the same thing. We're going to work together with the same doctrine. That's not what these people here were offering. They wanted union. They wanted to be able to come in and build the temple of God, but they really weren't worshiping God. And one of the reasons I say that is because they became the adversaries. And the point is that fellowship is, by definition, means joint working together based on a common faith, based on common doctrine. And if you don't have the common faith, don't have the common doctrine, there's no basis of fellowship. It'd be similar today. And I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but it'd be similar today, the Muslim religion. I read a number of years ago, I gave a lesson about Christ law. And it's the idea of merging together Christianity and Islam, the religion of Islam together. And the certain places where actively trying to do that, there's not a basis of fellowship between those who worship Allah and those who worship Jehovah. Those believe that Jesus is Son of God, and those believe that Muhammad is the last great prophet. There's no basis of fellowship at all between them. And so we have to keep that in mind as far as we want to be nice people. We cannot compromise the truth for simply the sake of some kind of unity. Well, so they said, no, you're not allowed to build in a temple. At that point here, then, those who were, again, the adversaries, they take upon themselves, and this is their time of Artaxerxes. It says, verse 7, chapter 4, verse 7, Ezra, they wrote a letter to the king of Persia. Remember, we talked about Artaxerxes a little bit earlier. And the letter, basically, in verse 12, gets down to this point here and says, these folks here at Jerusalem are building the rebellious and evil city, and are finished its walls, repairing the foundations. And then goes on verse 13, if this city is built and the wall is completed, they will not pay tax, tribute, or custom, and the king's treasure will be diminished. Now because we receive support from the place, from the palace, it's not proper for us to see the king's dishonor. Therefore, I have sent and informed the king. And what they're saying is, we are being just good subjects. And, those folks over here, they're rebellious people and they're hard-headed. And if they get to rebuild this temple or rebuild the city, they're not going to serve you anymore. And so that's what the letter basically says. And the Persian official received this, said, okay, stop the work. But it's for a purpose. In verse 15, they said, stop the work, search that search may be made in the book of the records of your fathers, and you will find in the book of the records and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces, and they have incited sedition within the city in former times, for which this city was destroyed. Now we're referring to it obviously as during the time of Solomon and the kings, how they were ruled that area of the province and all that region, and that they had rebelled against Babylon time and again and against Assyria. And so that's what we're talking about. And so verse 16, we inform the king that the city is rebuilt and its walls are completed. The result will be that you will have no dominion beyond the river. Now that phrase, beyond the river, refers to the whole region. In other words, if you allow them to rebuild their city and rebuild their temple, they're going to rebel against you, and you don't want that. That was their argument to the Persian officials. And so the Persian officials received this. And again, they said, okay, stop the work, and let us search the records. Now, and so it was discontinued in verse 24 until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia, about 520 BC. So for a number of years here, it was stopped. And the reason, because they had to search the records. Today, we have Google search, we have computers, and we have the internet where we can search for things very easily. But imagine back then, a king would write a decree and it would be filed someplace, and then he would die, another king take over, and then somebody says, well, what did this first king issue? And you have to think, well, how are we going to find that out? Just by a record search. You have to go through every record, every detail, every place he wrote something, has to be searched, and that's what's going on here. And so they're searching to find out what is that Cyrus the king had actually decreed these Jews could do, because the adversaries are alleging that these folks came back and are doing something without any authority. Well, that gets to the 5th chapter now. In the 5th chapter, we have two prophets mentioned that are very prominent in the Old Testament, Haggai and Zechariah. And Haggai is a very short book with a very simple message, and that is, get to work. Rebuild the temple. Why are you not building the temple? And Zechariah is a little more complicated, but it's along the lines of God's going to restore you and what God has promised you. So these are two very prominent prophets during this time period. And as you find that they stirred up the people, if you go to Haggai, the 1st chapter, again, a little side trip here for a second. Haggai, the 1st chapter. And in verse 14, it talks about the fact of the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, spirit of all the remnant of the people, and they came and worked in the house of the Lord, their God, of the host of their God, on the 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of King Darius. And so they get back to work then. Now, one of the things that's allowing them to do this, and this is before there's really an official proclamation saying, okay, you can start back to work. Okay, they've been told to stop. A number of years passed by, and Haggai and Zechariah said, we need to get to work. And so they start doing that. Well, one of the reasons that they're allowed to work here for a while without any interference is because in the Persian Empire, they have some instability going on. And I'm just going to read you a little bit about one of the historical narratives about this time period. And that is, it said, the death of Cambyses on the return journey from Egypt and the usurpation of Gautama led turmoil. So he had one king or emperor that had died on the way back from Egypt. You had another that tried to usurp authority. And so at the death of Cambyses, an officer under him named Darius immediately claimed the throne. He marched eastwards towards Gautama, defeated and executed him. Revolts broke out all over the empire, Media, Elam, Armenia. As a result of this turmoil over who was the king, Zerubbabel and Joshua took advantage of this confusion to resume work on the temple. So what he's saying is basically because of the political and military instability inside the Persian Empire at that time, the attention was taken off of this little land, this little city really of Jerusalem, this little place called Canaan, and it was more about the empire itself. And so that allowed the Jews here to start back in the work and not be stopped. Now, the Persian officials at this point, in the 5th chapter, verse 3, it talks about Gatanea. He's the governor. He's a Persian official. The region beyond the river. So that refers to all this area here. And that they came and said, who's commanding you to build this temple, finish this wall? In other words, okay, who told you to start back doing this job? And basically, there's going to be, again, the search for what records there are. But verse 5 said, but the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews so that they could not make them cease till a report could go to Darius. And so the first time, basically, when the charge was made by the adversaries, they were told to stop, and they did. This time here, the question comes up, who told you could do this? And they said, well, you find out, but we're going to keep on working. And so they keep on working. So these officials, Tatanea and others, they sent a letter to the Persian officials, to the king, and it says in verse 17, the 5th chapter, if it seems good to the king, let a search be made in the king's treasure, which is there in Babylon, whether so that decree was issued by King Cyrus to build this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send us his pleasure concerning this matter. So there is just really just kind of taking business, saying we need to find out if what they're saying is true, that they were given this proclamation, and whether or not they need to be allowed to work, and we'll do whatever you say to do, king. And so they find that this decree by Cyrus, and that decree not only said allow the Jews to go back to the land, but also allow them to build the temple, and even specify the size of the temple. In the 6th chapter of Ezra, in verse 3, it says, let the foundations of it be firmly laid, its height 60 cubits, and width 60 cubits. Now, a cubit is about 1.5 feet, and so about 90 feet by 90 feet is what he's saying. Let them build the house, but the point is, they say let them build it, and it goes even beyond that, because he says, verse 4 of the 6th chapter of Ezra, let the expense be paid from the king's treasury. So they're really, I mean, he has really given them almost like carte blanche here, and that is, let them go back to homeland, let them rebuild the temple, and let the expense be at my expense or the king's expense, the nation's expense. And so that's what goes on here. And in verse 5 it said that the Nebuchadnezzar had taken vessels, had taken the furnishings of the temple away. And so in verse 5 it said, let the gold and silver articles of the house of God. Now, this again what Cyrus is saying, let those things which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple which is in Jerusalem, and brought to Babylon, be restored and taken back to the temple which is in Jerusalem, east of this place, and deposit them in the house of God. So not only build this temple at my expense, but give them back everything we took. Any vessels on or anything of gold or silver, we'll have it back. And so, as you look at, Darius now is now the king. And Darius then issues his proclamation, and he says, verse 7 of the 6th chapter of Ezra again, let the work of this house of God alone, let the governor of Jews and the elders of Jews build this house of God on a site. So leave them alone, let them build it. And therefore, as you go here in the latter part of chapter 6, you'll find in verse 15, it says, the temple was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which is the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. So it restarted on the 24th day of the 6th month, in the 2nd year of King Darius. And it's finished in the 12th month. Adar is the 12th month, which would be February, March, basically. And so it was finished in 516 BC, basically when it's finished. And so that's how long it took them to actually build a temple. Now, the latter part of this study here deals with the dedication. And I'll just read verses 16 and 17, 18. It said, then the children of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the descendants of the captivity, celebrated the dedication of this house of God joy. And they offer sacrifice to the dedication of this house of God, 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. They assigned the priests to the divisions, and the Levites to the divisions of the service of God in Jerusalem, as is written in the book of Moses. Now, if you go back and read about the dedication of the temple of Solomon, the sacrifice is immensely greater. This is what they had, and this was what they dedicated the temple with. And then verse 19 points out that they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the 1st month. And then in verse 22, they kept the feast of unleavened bread, 7 days of joy. So now we have the temple rebuilt. We have them again observing all the laws of Moses, all the parts of it, all the festivals and everything that the law of Moses specifies has been reinstated now. And so that's where we get to. Let me just make a few points and then the lesson will be yours. And point number 1 here is read through this. I'm sorry for the clock dinging here. I went a little longer than I thought I would here. But they started their worship without the temple. But that did not hinder the worship of God. Now, the temple had to be rebuilt, but they started with the worshiping God. They had to lay a solid foundation of the temple. And today we have to have a good foundation. The foundation we have is Jesus Christ and his death. That is our foundation of our salvation, is Jesus Christ. That's the foundation of the very church. A third thing is good works often face opposition. That they're doing something good here. And the people of the land tried to stop them by 2 methods here. One is fear. They tried to make them afraid. And the second is discouragement. And the same thing today. If you're trying to do something good, don't be surprised somebody starts criticizing you, somebody starts threatening you, somebody gets mad at you. Just keep on doing your good work. And the fourth thing is the truth as a powerful weapon. The truth is that they had the authority to rebuild their temple. The truth is the king has said to. The truth is God wanted them to rebuild the temple. That was more important than anything else. And today, we have the truth. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father through me. Jesus said, sanctify them in thy truth, thy word is truth. John 17:17. And so the truth is powerful, and we always need to do what it says. I appreciate you watching, and hopefully this helped you in your study of Ezra. As I've said before, if you appreciate this study, hit the like button on YouTube here, and feel free to share it. And for others, maybe to study out of the book of Ezra. If you can, come be with us on Lilac Road in Litchfield, Kentucky on Sunday mornings. We have Bible class at 9:30, worship at 10:25, and on Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. we have Bible class at 7 p.m. And so our building is located at 1687 Lilac Road, Litchfield, Kentucky. I appreciate you watching. Hope you have a good day.